In Singapore, it's a much better way of governing, and we've lost that ability in the United States to do that.
Meet Stephen O'Con, an American who's lived in Singapore for 23 years. He worked in President Clinton's administration, served as chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore, and is often featured in global media as a political expert. Stephen shared why Singapore is better than America at adopting the world's best practices, how Singapore won over Hong Kong, and what the biggest risk is for Singapore in the future. I'm Max Chernov, let's go.
I remember the first time, I was in a room with Lee Kuan Yew. It was the 30th anniversary, I think, of Singapore-China relations. They had a big event in the Shangri-La Ballroom. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people. And I got invited. I was chair of AmCham Singapore then. So I got invited, and Lee Kuan Yew and Tommy Koh were doing a fireside chat. And Tommy, I got to know a little bit then. He had been U.S. ambassador, or Singapore's ambassador to the U.S. He negotiated the U.S.-Singapore FTA. So Tommy's interviewing Lee Kuan Yew, and then Tommy says, okay, we're going to take some questions from the audience, and there's two planted questions, and not softballs, but I mean, there were two people that they were going to call on. They had specific questions ready, and those questions came up, and then, Tommy says, okay, does anyone else have a question? No one raises their hand.
That was scary.
Exactly. I mean, in a room of hundreds of people, Singaporeans, right, mostly, a few of us, no one raises their hand, and I'm like, okay, I can't not ask a question. So I raised my hand. I'm probably about 30 feet away in the ballroom. I hear Lee Kuan Yew go to Tommy. He goes, who is that? I don't know him. And then the mics come over and Tommy's like, Steve, can you please introduce yourself? I'm like, oh my God. No wonder why no one raised their hand. So that was, I'll never forget that moment. And it really just showed, he was no longer prime minister even. I think he was minister mentor then.
Yeah.
But it was really,
it was tough.
It was tough. That one was really impressive.
Do you think Singapore is still like an exciting place to be? Like before, like they say, golden years of Hong Kong was 80s and 90s. Like Singapore was like fun place, a lot of growth probably in the 90s and like 10-15 years ago. Now it's like already there, a bit slowed down. Like now, like maybe Middle East is growing, and like Southeast Asia countries are growing also, like Indonesia growing big time, Vietnam. You think Singapore is still exciting place to be?
In my world of geopolitics, I think Singapore is the most exciting place to be because it's at the nexus of everything. It's at the nexus of the West in the East. It's at that nexus of U.S. and China. It has connectivity to not only Southeast Asia, South Asia. It has connectivity to the Middle East. I think from a geopolitical perspective, this is going to be one of the most exciting places in the world. I think it has been, for the last decade plus, and certainly if you could take a crystal ball for 5 or 10 more years, this is still going to be the most exciting place.
What changes have you seen like through this 23, 24 years in Singapore?
Singapore has gone from my perspective, really from a regional city, a very important city in Southeast Asia, to being a global city, from a financial perspective, from a geopolitical perspective. I mean, and Singapore has plotted this, and they have done. So part of it is a very intentional part of what Singapore has done to grow and to continue to grow. Part of it is the geopolitical environment. Part of it is that as you have China rising and you have increasing tensions between not just the U.S. and China, but between Japan and China, between Europe and China, between the West and China, and where Singapore and Southeast Asia is trying to balance those two things. So it becomes an even more interesting place to be. And so part of it has been, I think, intentional from Singapore's growth. Part of it has been just the geopolitical environment and how Singapore has been able to navigate it as well as anybody.
And I guess before it was Hong Kong and Singapore, or sometimes versus Singapore. But now, because Hong Kong is like losing its position like globally, I guess it shifted to Singapore, and like more attention shift to Singapore.
Well, I think part of it has been a natural course, and that is Singapore has grown as Southeast Asia has grown, as India has grown from an economic perspective, from a global geopolitical perspective, Singapore is a better place to be headquartered than Hong Kong. Hong Kong has all that connectivity historically, of course, into China, to North Asia, whereas Singapore started to really grow in terms, along with Southeast Asia, along with India. Now, what has hypercharged it, of course, is that Hong Kong has become another Chinese city, an important Chinese city. It is important to be there, but as Hong Kong becomes increasingly a Chinese city as opposed to a global city, that also accelerates the move to Singapore if you're talking about where do you go from a global perspective, Hong Kong or Singapore.
What do you think the main competitors for Singapore? Like Dubai right now, like in terms of like where expats are going, where like the more economic and like geopolitical power is shifting?
Well, I think from a geopolitical perspective, Singapore has that uniqueness because it really has that balance more so between the U.S. and China, where the U.S. the U.S. is the largest investor into Singapore, into Southeast Asia, but China is the largest trading nation, and so you have both dynamics here. That is very different than Dubai or the Middle East. I mean, anywhere, Saudi Arabia, you pick. It is a different dynamic. So certainly people are going to go there because there is growth. And if you're talking about Middle East versus is Singapore in terms of growth opportunities, it's much more nascent there. There's a lot of opportunity. First movers are going there. But this is going to be the anchor now and for the foreseeable future because of the dynamic between the U.S. and China, and that Singapore is important for both, and it's important to both.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest risks for Singapore within the next like 10 years?
I think the risks for everybody, not just Singapore, but I think the risks for everybody are how do you balance between the U.S. and China? You know, the U.S. used to view China as really a strategic competitor to it. Now you can argue that China has not viewed the U.S. as a strategic competitor, that China has been engaging in unfair practices against the U.S. for decades now in terms of the economy, in terms of militarily, in terms of geopolitics. And now the U.S. has shifted, and now the U.S. looks at China very differently. And if we're in a world of decoupling between the U.S. and China, that is going to put countries like Singapore in a very different place than they are today. And right now, leaders of Singapore, of Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, they all say the same thing. Don't make us choose between the U.S. And China. And increasingly, both the U.S. and China are saying, well, you're going to have to choose in some ways. Now, the question is, are you going to have to choose in many ways? And if there is a decoupling, that is going to hurt the global economy. And as a trading nation, which Singapore is, if the global economy gets hit, Singapore gets hit, even if it can keep good relations with the U.S. and China simultaneously.
Yeah. This channel is now my full-time job. But before, I worked as an engineer, brand manager, I ran a media agency. But YouTube is actually my dream job. Small team, big profits, everything is done remotely, and it aligns with my passions and values. So some of you might be also thinking to start a YouTube channel for, let's say, some additional passive or semi-passive income. So I made a video lesson for you where I break down my 5-step strategy, which helped me to grow this channel to almost 350,000 subscribers within just 2 years. I also used the same one to grow my other channel, different language, different niche, to 300,000 subscribers. And I always use the same strategy when I help my students and clients to grow their channels. I also explained how this blueprint can help you build a semi-passive income stream of at least $10,000 a month. So this lesson is packed with value, and I'll probably start selling it later. But for now, I'm giving it away for free. So I'll leave a link in description, click it and grab it if it's still available. How do you think your personality changed through this 23, 24 years in Singapore?
The part I think that's changed, that has opened my eyes much more so, is certainly when I would have lived in the US, I would have said, how do you think of the United States as a country, as a government? I would have said, well, the United States is the best country in the world, full stop. I mean, that's where I would have been and was.
You grew up with
23
it,
years. It's where it was, and
Yeah.
I worked in the U.S. government, and that was kind of, I had a very U.S.-centric view.
Yeah.
Now, if you say, what do you think of, where does the United States fit within the world? I would say, look, I love my country. I love the United States. That said, the United States isn't perfect. We don't know everything. There's a lot we can learn from other countries. There's a lot we can learn from other governments. There's a lot we can learn from other people. And in understanding that, having a global perspective as opposed to an American perspective, that is how I've changed the most from from the work that I do in the past 23 years.
Can you give me an example? Let's say after living for so many years in Singapore, what would you like to see in the US? Maybe that US don't have, but Singapore has it. Like something that can be implemented in the US based on Singapore's experience.
You look at how Singapore is able to plan things, and some of this is very difficult. I mean, we're in literally, a city-state of about 5 million people versus a country of hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah.
You can't really compare, say, let's just do what Singapore does. It's very, very different. But where Singapore has been able to understand, and it's doing it right now, being able to explain why being global is important, why having immigrants is important, what are the benefits that we can bring when we welcome people from outside the world, while we also take care of our own citizens, having the government being out front on that, like they're doing right now. It's just something we haven't done in the United States. We were never able to explain why immigration was so important while also taking care of Americans.
Yeah.
And we're trying, hopefully the Americans are going to learn that now. We go from one extreme to the other. So I think having that government and being able to explain both sides and trying to set the agenda is very important.
Yeah.
One of the things that when I first came to Singapore, 23 years ago, and I had been out of the U.S. government for about 3 years at that point. So I came here with UPS, and the Minister for Trade and Industry called us into his office, and it was me and the President of UPS, and we had both just arrived in Singapore. And he said, look, it's important for us to know what businesses are doing. It's important for us to know what businesses need. It's important for us to know what other governments are doing so that we as a government can stay ahead. And, I was like, we never did that when I was in the U.S. We talked about it. We talked about how important it was to have people come in from the outside, but we were always so busy. You're always putting out fires. You're always, answering a reporter's question. You get in the Hill calling you, get in the White House calling you, and you're never having that time to listen and be proactive. And I was always impressed from literally the day I arrived from the Singapore government. I wish we had done that, and the U.S. still doesn't do that.
I think it starts at Lee Kuan Yew era, when he actually used all the best practices from all over the world, in military, in economics, and so basically bringing best people as consultants as well to actually learn from them and implement it in Singapore.
Yeah. And
that's what LKY did.
Well, I remember that a friend in the Singapore government, relatively senior, kind of in the permanent secretary, and he told me he was going to go to the U.S. For about 6 months, and he was going to go do a tour. I mean, this was about 10 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm going to go to Washington, I'm going to go to Boston, I'm going to go to Austin, I'm going to go to San Francisco. I want to learn what's happening on the ground in those places so that we can bring those lessons back here. Are there people who you'd recommend for me to meet in those places, and can you make a connection for me? So I can meet them. And I was like, this is really impressive.
Yeah.
Here you get, take somebody senior in the government, give them 6 months, go to the U.S. to learn, and then bring back best practices. I mean, it is that type of foresight you get in a government here. Very few governments will do that. That will invest the time and the money and the right people to get them done. There are very good people in governments all over Asia. I mean, I get the opportunity in Malaysia, Vietnam, China, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, all over Asia. I meet with government officials. They're smart people everywhere. There are people who are dedicated to advancing the public interest from their specific country's perspective everywhere. It's just, this place is a little bit different because it takes those good people, but then empowers them, but also gives them such a broad scope of what to learn.
Working with politicians with the governments of Singapore, how things are done differently compared to what you've seen in the U.S. administration?
There's politics everywhere. I think more in the U.S. system, and increasingly so, decisions get made with a short-term political outlook to them, and that you're not letting the public, you're not being driven as much by what you know is the right policy. You're not being driven as much is what you know is the public interest. It becomes too much about politics. I remember the first time I went up to brief the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives. There's committees that in Congress that focus in specific areas, and so I was going to brief the House Transportation and Infrastructure Aviation Subcommittee because we were going to go testify at a hearing, and so I had to go brief the committee before the hearing to let them understand what it was that we as the Clinton administration were trying to do, and hear from them what they wanted to hear from us. So I go in, and the Democrat says, "Can you come up and brief?" And I said, "Sure." This is a long time ago. So I go up to brief, and he's like, "Well, let me get my Republican counterpart." And I'm like, "I'm going to brief you at the same time?" He's like, "Why would we make you come up twice?" I'm like, okay, makes sense. And so the Democrat and the Republican get in the room together with me and a couple other staffers, and so they're asking me questions. I'm answering, everything I can, and there's a couple of things I didn't know. And I said, okay, at the end of the meeting, let me go back and talk to the policy people and get the information for you. And I said, what's your fax number? And I go to because there was no email back then. Right? I go to the Democrat, what's your fax number? He gives me his fax number. I go to the Republican, what's your fax number? He goes, same as his. I go, you guys share a fax machine? He's like, why would we waste money on two fax machines? If his name's on it, I don't look. If my name's on it, he doesn't look. And I was like, wow, that does not happen. Forget the fax machine piece. There's just the Democrats and Republicans are basically opposed on everything now. And it's now all political. And it wasn't back then. And in Singapore, it is not political here. I mean, yes, you make decisions here. You could see where politics can come into very certain things, but it's really focused on the public interest here. And that's a very different way of governing. It's a much better way of governing, and we've lost that ability in the United States to do that for any number of reasons, which we could go on for hours about.
Also, as far as I know, I heard from Singaporeans as well, Singapore does a good job of selling to their people why they decided about something. So the decision-making process. If they raise, I don't know, their bus ticket by 10%. Actually, someone from the government told me he had a hard time after they raised, it was long time ago, 25, 30 years. They raised by 10% the bus price ticket. He needed to explain it to the audience. So it's not okay, tomorrow it will be plus 10%. They're actually doing a good job of explaining and selling it to the audience. So the audience is happy or more or less happy.
And that's what, and that's what government officials should be doing that everywhere. Yeah. And they do it here as well as they do it in most places. Part of government is you have trade-offs, and you have to explain why you're making those trade-offs. This is the problem that we have in the United States, is that people aren't willing to make trade-offs, or they're not willing to say that we have to have trade-offs. And President Trump says, well, I'm going to give tax cuts to literally everybody. He's in his joint address to Congress, a week or so ago, he said, I'm going to give tax cuts. No more tax on overtime. No more tax on tips. No more tax in terms of, we're going to extend the tax cuts that we have in place. So literally giving a tax cut to everybody. Oh, but by the way, I'm not going to touch the budget when it comes to Social Security or Medicare, which is the biggest part of where the U.S. expenditure is. You can't do both. You have to have trade-offs. And Trump is the worst at it, but there's a lot of American politicians who equally do not tell the truth. They tell the truth. Yeah, I mean, they're government, and they say, yeah, we're going to have trade-offs because all of life is trade-offs. What are you going to trade one thing for the other? They do that well here. We do it terribly in the United States. Donald Trump's not the only one, but that speech to Congress was a master class in not telling people you can't have everything.
What do you think the biggest misconceptions in the US about China and about like how China run, how things work in China, you think?
Well, China's changed a lot from the very first time I went there till now, and it really started to change. You could go back to the Beijing Olympics, which I spent the entire Olympics in Beijing because I was with UPS then, and we were the official logistics sponsor for the Beijing organizing committee, BOCOG. And at that time, it was how can we work with China? How can China work with us to help them, grow their economy, to help them become more global, to help them become more integrated, to raise living standards in China that would benefit everyone. And so China really went, as I saw it, and I think as most Americans would see it now, from looking to really integrate into the existing global trading system, into the global rules-based order, to changing. And maybe right after the Olympics, and you can go sometime in the next few years after, where China shifted from saying, okay, instead of being part of the existing rules-based system, we should be rewriting the rules-based system. We should be an architect of the rules-based system. Why is it that we're just going into the existing one? Why isn't that we're not creating a different one? And that's what changed. And so I think the people within the Chinese government didn't change, but what became the public interest, what became the priority of the Chinese government changed. Now maybe they were changing that whole time and we missed it, or I missed it, but it's very clear now. And that's the shift that happened.
Yeah. On the officials level or politicians level, what would be your strategy to get along well with Chinese when you came there with your company? So like your interactions with the officials in China, how did you do it? Like to make friends with them, to align like your expectations with them, like on a human being level?
Yeah. Okay. It's the way you do public affairs globally. It's the same model everywhere. There isn't a model that you use in China versus Washington, versus Tokyo, versus Singapore, versus Delhi. And so there's three core P's that you have when it comes to public affairs. What's the policy? What are the politics? And what's the public interest? And then I would say a fourth, what's the process? So you have to know those four P's wherever you go. So if the most important when you're dealing with, I think, with any government, is the public interest. What is it that China views as its public interest? What does Singapore view as its public interest? What does the US view as its public interest? What does that official who's sitting across the table from you view as the public interest? So you have to know what they're thinking. You have to know how they're defining public interest, because if you're going in asking for something that is not in the public interest, they're not going to do it. They're not going to listen to you. Now, you've got to then figure out what is it, how do they define public interest? I can't do that, right, as an American in a lot of places. So I have to work with people in China who know China, who also know what is it that we're doing. I remember one time I was in China, and then meeting somebody at a not even a director general level, but a level below that, and this was during the U.S.-China Air Services Agreement negotiations, and I was bringing someone in with me who had never been to a meeting in the government in China before, and I had gotten to know my friend there, and I said, look, he reminds me of people like me. You think, it's the Chinese government, and they must be very strict, and they must be very, very regimented, and everything has to be very much what the party says. I said, this meeting is going to be like a meeting you'd have in Washington, D.C. I mean, he's really smart. He wants to learn. He wants to understand what's happening. Now he's putting it into the context of what's most important for China. But you have a discussion with him like anybody else. And that's, and that I'll never forget that meeting. And it's because it was a dawning on me that the people who are attracted to government they're no different. Like, I'm attracted to government in the U.S. People who are attracted to government here, even be it China, Vietnam, Singapore, wherever, we're all kind of the same. You know, we're all trying to do the right thing. We're all trying. Now, what you need to understand is, what does he define as the public interest?
Yeah.
Not what do you think he should define as the public interest from a Chinese perspective. Not what he should be defining it, right? It's what does he define it as, and then how can I communicate that with him? And so that kind of light bulb moment, that was relatively early during my time in Asia, really stood out because people in government are all kind of the same all over the world.
Any advice for like normal people, like how to live in this like very volatile environment at the moment when you don't know what's going on?
If you're following geopolitics, I mean, the advice I'd give is, you know, we are in a very different world. Get ready to adapt to where that world is going to be geopolitically. We don't know, and so we have to kind of throw out some of our old assumptions of what worked and why, and get ready for a new phase. So I think that's
One of the things, I think if you want to be a little bit more of a, I guess, optimist, realist, if you don't want to get depressed or you don't want to be, you know, about everything, you know, we lived in a world, you know, Max, you and I grew up in a time that was a very unique period from a geopolitical perspective.
Yeah.
There was, relatively speaking, you know, peace throughout the world that was really guaranteed by the United States. And that, you know, kind of came, if you want to go through it, from the time of, you know, the Berlin Wall fell until relatively recently. And then that system is a blip. That's not what the world was like before. Before that, you had World War I, you had World War II, you had so many different conflicts.
when we left that era and we were in, you know, the 90s and the aughts. That was a unique time, and we're going back. Unfortunately, we've left that time and we've gone back into a time of geopolitical conflict. We lived through it. You know, some people did very well. People adjusted to it. Governments did fine. Businesses did fine. People did fine. You know, we'll do fine. But it's going to we're going to have to readjust a bit of our expectations there as well.
What's the meaning of life for you?
Make a difference with what you do. Make a difference for who you're impacting. Can you make the world a better place in whatever the unique way that you can do it, and so I've tried to do that when I can, maybe not as often as I should, but I mean, I think that's kind of how I envision where you want to go and what you should do.